1851 Alabama, the slave who was tied to dogs, until one day no one disrespected him anymore. Under the scorching Alabama sun of 1851, the air was thick with dust and dread. Whispers crawled through the fields, stories carried on the wind about a man they called Josiah, a slave who refused to bow, even when every lash of the whip demanded that he should. His defiance was quiet, not in words, but in the way he looked at his master, steady, unbroken, alive. And that was what frightened them most. For in a place where obedience meant survival, the spark of dignity was more dangerous than fire. They said Josiah had been chained to the dogs, beasts bred not for guarding, but for punishing. Men would gather to watch, laughing as the hounds were unleashed, their snarls echoing through the night. Yet somehow, Josiah endured. He bore every wound, every bite, every humiliation, and still he lived. No one could explain how. Some whispered that something inside him refused to die. Others said something, or someone, was watching over him from the dark edges of the plantation, waiting for the day when the cruelty would come full circle. But tonight, you'll hear what the records never told. You'll hear the story buried beneath decades of silence, the story they tried to erase, because Josiah's suffering was not the end. It was the beginning of something that would haunt those lands forever. And there, as one final revelation, that only those who stay until the end will learn, a secret unearthed from beneath the very soil he bled upon. Imagine this: a moonless night, the only light coming from the torches held by trembling hands. The master's voice rises, cruel and confident, commanding the slaves to gather and watch. Josiah stands in the center, chained, his breath slow and shallow. Around him the dogs grow restless, sensing fear, but not his. The others can barely look. Some pray, some cry, and yet Josiah, broken in body but not in spirit, raises his head just enough to meet the eyes of the man who owned him. That gaze, steady, burning, would be remembered long after both men were gone. This isn't just a story of pain. It's about what happens when one man's endurance bends the laws of fear. When silence becomes rebellion, when every scar becomes a prophecy. And if you think you know how this tale ends, think again, because the truth of what followed, the nights of howling, the sudden disappearances, the cursed whispers in the cotton fields, will leave you questioning what vengeance truly means. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why, after that night, no one on that plantation ever disrespected Josiah again. Some say it was guilt, others say it was terror. But there are those who believe it was something else entirely. Something that never left those lands, something that still lingers in the ruins that remain. Stay until the final moments, because hidden within the last few lines of this story lies an exclusive revelation, a detail historians ignored, one that changes everything we thought we knew about 1851 Alabama and the man they tried to break. And believe me, no one was prepared for what they discovered. If you were drawn to the shadows of forgotten history, to the stories that were buried, because they were too cruel, too strange, or too powerful, you're in the right place. This is where truth and darkness meet. This is where the past whispers back. And what it has to say tonight will chill you long after the screen fades to black. So listen closely, because every sound, every flicker of torchlight, every heartbeat that still echoes from that night, it all leads to one revelation, one moment of truth. And once you hear it, you'll never forget it. Alabama, 1851. The state was a cauldron of heat, cruelty, and silence. Cotton ruled everything: the land, the people, even the air itself. The plantations stretched like kingdoms, their white mansions standing proud above the fields, symbols of wealth built on suffering. Beneath that facade of order and civility lay a darker truth, a world of screams muffled by walls, of lives measured by the strength of their hands and the obedience in their eyes. In those days, justice was not written in law, it was written in blood. The plantation of Colonel Warren stood among the largest in the region, its reputation whispered across counties. He was a man of charm in public, a host of grand dinners, a name respected by the powerful. But behind the closed doors of his estate, his temper was as sharp as his cane, and his pleasure came from the humiliation of others. The slaves feared him more than death itself. For death, at least, was freedom. He believed he owned not only their bodies, but their souls. Yet even the cruelest masters have their fears. And for Colonel Warren, that fear began with the man called Josiah. The quarters where the enslaved slept were lined in rotting wood, a maze of shadow and whisper. Every night, the wind carried voices through the cracks, stories of hauntings, of spirits who never found rest, of justice that waited beneath the soil. Some believed the plantation was cursed long before it was built, resting on stolen land where the dead never slept. Others said the curse began when the first man was whipped to death beneath the oak at the edge of the fields, a tree the slaves named the Hanging God. Its branches were wide enough to hold many, its roots deep enough to drink what fell from above. Josiah's cabin was near that oak. He had arrived years earlier, sold from another estate after striking a foreman who insulted his dead wife. No one ever spoke to him about that act again, but the rumor lived on, that he had cursed the man before he died, and that curse followed him here. The overseers avoided his eyes, even the dogs seemed uneasy around him. He worked in silence, his body scarred, his gaze heavy with something no whip could erase. And perhaps that was why the master hated him most, because Josiah reminded him of his own weakness, his own mortality. At dusk, when the air turned cool and the cicadas began their chant, strange sounds would drift from the fields, chains rattling when no one was there, growls that came from empty pens, footsteps along the veranda though all the doors were locked. The slaves said the land was remembering, that every cruelty soaked into it like rain, waiting to rise again. The white men laughed, until the laughter stopped. No one knows exactly when the dogs changed. Once loyal to their master, they began to grow restless, snarling at shadows, refusing to obey. They would stare into the night for hours, tails low, teeth bared, as if they sensed something moving beyond sight. Some nights, their howls rose like lamentations, echoing through the cotton rows until even the overseers crossed themselves. And in the middle of it all, Josiah remained calm. He would look toward the darkness and whisper something no one else could hear. There was talk among the house servants that Josiah had something, a charm, a mark, an ancient prayer from a motherland long forgotten. The elders called it the bond of the blood, a protection that turned pain into strength. The younger ones dismissed it as myth. But in the deep south, where every breath carried superstition, even disbelief trembled before what it could not explain. The deeper you look into the story, the more the air itself seems to shift. You begin to picture the long nights on that cursed land, the flicker of lanterns against the walls, the soft hum of fear that never left the throats of the enslaved. You can almost smell the mix of iron and smoke. Hear the dogs pacing in their cages, their claws scratching against the wood as if trying to dig through time itself. What you be about to hear is not just a story. It's a fragment of something the South tried to bury. A moment in history wrapped in the smell of sweat and ash, where cruelty turned to legend and legend turned to warning. Because on that plantation, one act of injustice would awaken something that could never be chained again, something that would turn masters into prey and silence into a weapon. The night Josiah was chained to the dogs was not the end of his suffering. It was the beginning of the reckoning. Josiah was not a tall man, nor was he built like the strong field hands who carried sacks of cotton from dawn until dusk. His frame was lean, worn by years of labor, his back a map of scars that told stories no one dared ask about. Yet his eyes, dark, steady, unyielding, held something that even the whip could not touch. In the stillness of night, when others whispered prayers for mercy, Josiah prayed for remembrance. He wanted the world to remember every name, every cry, every injustice buried beneath that crimson soil. He spoke little, and when he did, his words carried weight. "A man ain't gone till his name stops being spoken," he once told an old woman who sat near the fire, rocking and humming songs from the motherland. The others said Josiah's words lingered, that even after he walked away they stayed in the air like smoke. He was not just a slave, he was a vessel of stories, of pain turned into quiet defiance. The young ones followed him with their eyes, hoping to catch even a sliver of his strength. Then there was Ruth, the house servant who'd grown up on the plantation. Her voice was soft, her steps light, but her memory was sharper than glass. She remembered every soul who'd been sold, every scream that echoed from the whipping post. She'd seen Josiah brought in, half dead, his wrists torn from the chains, his face covered in blood. But what struck her wasn't his suffering. It was the way he looked up at the master with something that wasn't to fear. That look haunted her ever since. In the quiet moments, when she passed Josiah his share of bread or bandaged the fresh wounds on his back, she wondered if that look was courage or madness. The master, Colonel Warren, was a man of contradictions. To his guests, he was the image of refinement, quoting scripture, hosting soirees, dressing in tailored linen. But to those beneath him, he was a creature of cruelty. His power depended on fear, and Josiah's silence was the one thing he could not command. Every act of defiance, a stare, a pause before kneeling, a refusal to cry, cut deeper than any insult. Warren's fury grew like a sickness, feeding on humiliation. He began to see Josiah not as a man, but as an affront to his authority, a shadow that needed to be erased. There was also Silas, the overseer, a man hardened by years in the sun and the slow rot of conscience. He had once been poor himself, born to a family that owned nothing but debt. When he was hired by Warren, he thought he'd escaped misery. But the longer he stayed, the more the nightmares came. He'd seen too much, eyes of men dying in silence, women dragged away at night. Deep down, he knew the plantation was a place of rot, and Josiah was the one reminder of what little humanity he had left. And then there were the dogs, 6 of them, bred from a line of hounds known for their cruelty. Their names were whispered more than spoken: Brutus, Mercy, Cain, Shade, Iron and Ghost. To the slaves, they were demons in fur, trained to chase down runaways, to tear flesh until obedience was restored. But they were restless around Josiah. When he walked by their cages, they would growl low and deep but never bark. It was as if they recognized something in him, not fear, but familiarity. In the evenings, when the work was done and the world dimmed to shadows, Josiah would sit by the oak at the edge of the field. Ruth sometimes joined him there, careful not to be seen. They would speak in fragments, about freedom, about the rivers beyond the borders, about the stars that seemed to promise a life elsewhere. "They say every soul got a sound," Ruth whispered once. "Maybe when we gone, that sound still travel through the wind." Josiah looked up, his voice a whisper. "Then I'll make mine loud enough to shake heaven." Those who lived in the quarters began to believe that something was stirring around Josiah. The elders spoke of old spirits that followed the bloodline of those who refused to kneel. They said he carried more than flesh. He carried memory, vengeance, and the weight of every life broken before his. Even the children, who didn't fully understand, began to leave small offerings by his cabin: pebbles, scraps of cloth, bits of food, tokens for protection. It was through these people, these small flickers of hope and fear, that the story of Josiah began to breathe. He was no longer just a man in chains. He was the embodiment of a question that haunted every soul on that land. How long can cruelty go unpunished before the earth itself rises to remember? And though no one knew it yet, the answer was coming, in a night filled with fire, teeth, and the sound of vengeance taking shape. The first sign that something was wrong came in whispers, faint, uncertain, yet impossible to ignore. It began the morning after a night of strange howling that seemed to roll from the hills, blending with the moans of the wind. The slaves awoke uneasy, their bodies aching from labor, but their eyes drawn toward the kennels behind the main house. The air smelled different, thick, metallic, almost like rust. When Silas, the overseer, went to check, he found the wooden gate splintered, claw marks cutting deep into the boards. One of the dogs, Mercy, was missing. The others crouched in the corners, trembling, refusing to eat. Their eyes darted to the fields, as if something out there was watching. Colonel Warren dismissed it as nonsense. "Beasts go mad sometimes," he said, waving off their concerns. But that same day, a worker found strange prints by the oak, too large for a dog, too wide for a man. The soil around them was blackened, as if something had burned there, though no fire had been lit. Silas examined the ground and said nothing. His hand trembled slightly when he touched the scorched earth, feeling the faint warmth that still lingered beneath. He ordered the slaves to keep quiet about it, but secrets like that never stay buried for long. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. From her small window in the house servants' quarters, she could see Josiah sitting by the oak again, his silhouette still as stone. The moonlight caught the faint glint of something in his hands, a small piece of iron, maybe a broken chain link, or part of a shackle. He was rubbing it between his fingers, slowly, as if remembering something through touch alone. The dogs began to grow restless once more, pacing, whining, but not a single one dared approach him. She wanted to call out, to tell him to come inside, but her throat locked. In that moment, Josiah didn't look like a man. He looked like a memory refusing to fade. By dawn, the plantation was tense. Word spread that another dog had vanished, Shade, the largest of them. The remaining 4 barked violently at empty air. Their cages were reinforced, but the sound of their growls carried through the fields like thunder. The slaves tried to work as usual, but their eyes kept shifting toward the tree line, toward the shadowed forest beyond the fields. They spoke in hushed tones about the spirits of the oak, about how no cruelty went unanswered forever. One old man, his voice cracked by years of sun and sorrow, muttered, "The ground's rememberin', the blood's stirrin'." Silas reported the missing dogs to Colonel Warren, but the master was more irritated than alarmed. "They'll come back when they're hungry," he said, sipping his brandy. But his tone carried unease. When he walked past Josiah later that afternoon, he stopped. "You see any of my hounds, boy?" he asked, his words drawn out like a challenge. Josiah didn't lift his head. "Ain't seen nothing that wasn't already gone," he murmured. Warren froze, not sure if it was defiance or warning. He raised his cane, hesitated, then walked away. That evening, Ruth found something strange outside the kitchen steps, a patch of dirt disturbed, as though something had been buried and then dug up again. Beneath the loose soil lay a torn piece of fabric, soaked in something dark. It wasn't blood. It was thicker, sticky, like sap, and it smelled faintly of iron. When she showed it to Silas, he grew pale. "Leave it," he said, almost whispering. "Whatever it is, it ain't for us to touch." But later, when Ruth returned, the patch of dirt had been smoothed over perfectly flat, as if no one had ever been there. The air began to change after that. The nights grew colder, even though it was midsummer. The wind carried a sound, a low rhythmic thump, like a heartbeat rising from underground. The slaves started to wake, drenched in sweat, claiming to hear footsteps circling their cabins, soft and deliberate. One woman said she saw eyes gleaming just beyond the fields, not human, not animal, something else entirely. Josiah said nothing, but the look in his eyes grew distant. Sometimes He would hum a tune no one recognized, low and sorrowful, his hands tracing invisible symbols in the dirt. Ruth asked him what it meant once, and he replied softly, "It's a song for what's coming. Every chain got a sound before it breaks." And when the third night came, with the moon hidden and the wind still, the howling started again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the kennels. It was coming from the oak. By the fourth night, the air over the Warren plantation was heavy with dread. The dogs that remained refused to eat or move, their eyes fixed on the oak tree at the edge of the field. Every creak of the branches sent shivers through the quarters. The slaves whispered prayers beneath their breath, while the overseer, Silas, walked with a lantern, pretending not to be afraid. But everyone felt it. Something had shifted. Something was awake. Colonel Warren's anger had reached a boiling point. The disappearances of his prized hounds, the murmurs among his workers, the defiance in Josiah's silence, it was all an insult he could no longer bear. "Fear has taken root," he barked at Silas, "and fear spreads faster than fire. If I don't put an end to it now, they'll think I've gone soft." His eyes burned with a kind of fury that had nothing to do with the dogs. It was pride, wounded and festering. That night, he ordered Josiah brought to the center yard, the same place where punishments were carried out. The slaves were forced to gather, their faces ghostly in the torchlight. Warren stood tall, his cane in one hand, his pistol gleaming in the other. "This man," he said, pointing to Josiah, "is the reason for this unrest. His presence has poisoned your minds with fear and superstition. Tonight, it ends." Josiah was dragged forward, wrists bound, shirt torn open. His back bore the scars of 100 lashes, but his expression was calm, too calm. When Warren met his eyes, he saw no submission there, only a reflection of his own cruelty. "You think you frighten me," Warren hissed. "You're nothing." Josiah tilted his head slightly, voice low but steady. "Then why you trembling, master?" The words were soft, almost tender, but they struck like thunder. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Warren struck him across the face with the cane, the crack echoing like gunfire. "Chain him to the dogs," he ordered. "Let them remember who their master is." Silas hesitated, just for a second, then nodded and moved to obey. But as the slaves watched, they realized something was wrong. The 4 remaining dogs wouldn't move. They crouched low, whining, their eyes darting between Josiah and the oak. Warren shouted, kicked the cages, even struck one with his cane, but the animals refused. Then, without warning, one of them, Ironby, began to howl, a deep, mournful sound that sent every soul trembling. The other 3 joined in, their voices rising until the night itself seemed to shake. The slaves dropped to their knees, praying, weeping. Silas took a step back, whispering, "Lord, have mercy." Warren, furious, turned to Josiah. "What did you do to them?" Josiah didn't answer. He only looked toward the oak, its shadow stretching long and dark across the yard. The flames from the torches flickered, and for a moment it seemed as though the branches were moving against the wind. "Enough!" Warren screamed. He drew his pistol and aimed it at Josiah's chest. "You want to be remembered, boy? Let's see if hell remembers you." He pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed. A sharp click echoed, followed by silence. Warren's hand trembled as he tried again, but the weapon refused to fire. Behind him, one of the dogs, Ghost, began to growl, low and guttural. Warren turned, and for the first time there was fear in his eyes. Ruth couldn't bear to watch. She pressed her hands over her mouth, tears streaming. Around her, the others clung to each other, torn between horror and awe. Josiah stood motionless, eyes fixed on his master. "The ground's listening," he said softly, "and it's tired of drinking our blood." That moment broke something in the air, a silence so deep it felt alive. Then came a sound, a faint scraping, like metal dragging through dirt. It came from the direction of the oak. Silas turned his lantern toward it, but the light flickered, weak and yellow. Beneath the tree, something glinted in the soil. A chain, half buried, moving as if pulled from below. The slaves gasped. Warren stumbled backward, eyes wide. The dogs barked once sharply, then fell silent. And Josiah, still bound, still bleeding, smiled. A slow, weary smile that carried no joy, only inevitability. The night swallowed their cries. The flames wavered. And for the first time since the plantation had been built, the master looked smaller than the man he sought to break. When dawn came, the plantation was shrouded in a strange quiet, a silence so thick it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. The air was colder than it should have been, heavy with the smell of smoke and iron. No one spoke of what had happened in the yard the night before. Colonel Warren had dismissed the crowd before sunrise, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He gave no punishment, no orders, only walked back to his house and locked the door behind him. The dogs were gone. Their cages stood open, chains twisted, wood splintered. Some said they'd run into the woods, others whispered that they hadn't run at all. They'd been called. By midday, Ruth noticed something strange near the oak. The ground around it looked freshly turned, dark patches marking where the soil had been disturbed. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the dirt. It was damp, warm, almost pulsing beneath her hand. She recoiled, heart racing. When she looked up, she thought she saw a faint impression near the base of the tree. A footprint. Bare, human, yet too deep to belong to any living person. Silas came later with 2 field hands to inspect it. He carried a lantern even though the sun was high. When he knelt near the roots, his breath caught. There, half buried, was a bone, long, white, clean as if it had been placed there, not left by decay. "That's animal," one of the men muttered, but Silas shook his head slowly. "No, that ain't no animal." He tried to cover it back up, but as his shovel scraped the earth, a sound echoed, a hollow metallic clang. They froze. Silas knelt again, brushed the soil aside, and uncovered something that made his blood run cold. A rusted chain, thick and old, ending in a shackle still locked shut. Inside it were remnants of cloth and something darker, the color of dried blood. The chain led deeper into the ground, disappearing beneath the roots of the oak. "Bury it back," Silas whispered. "Now!" But the others had already stepped away, crossing themselves. That night, the whispers returned. The slaves said they heard the dogs again, not barking, not howling, but panting, pacing, as if circling something unseen. Josiah hadn't been seen since the punishment, yet no one had seen his body either. The master claimed he'd been confined in the smokehouse for disobedience. But Ruth knew it was a lie. She'd gone there herself, her heart hammering, and found the door unbarred. The room empty except for a broken chain on the floor and a single mark drawn on the wall, a crude circle with 6 lines radiating outward. 6, like the dogs. The atmosphere in the quarters turned suffocating. Children cried in their sleep. Grown men refused to step outside after dark. Silas began drinking more, stumbling through his rounds, muttering about the debt that's come due. When Ruth pressed him for answers, he told her the truth, or part of it. "This land ain't just cursed," he said. "It's owned by what we built it on. You think the screams just vanish. You think the blood don't remember." His voice broke, eyes glinting with something close to madness. "He's not gone, Ruth. Josiah's not gone." As the night deepened, a thick fog rolled over the fields, swallowing the trees, the house, even the stars. From somewhere beyond the oak, a low growl drifted through the mist. Not one voice, but many, layered and ragged, as if the air itself had learned to snarl. The sound grew louder, closer, until the earth beneath their feet trembled. Ruth clutched the rosary around her neck and whispered a prayer, but her words were drowned by a distant scream, a man's scream, cut short by silence. The next morning, Silas was found near the kennels. His lantern lay broken beside him, his throat marked by deep, jagged cuts. Not clean like a knife's, but torn, ragged animal. Yet the strangest part wasn't the wounds. It was his expression, eyes wide open, mouth twisted into something that almost looked like a smile. Around his body were paw prints, burned into the earth, glowing faintly in the early light. Colonel Warren ordered the body buried immediately. "We speak of this to no one," he hissed at his men. But fear had already taken hold. The slaves refused to go near the oak. The house servants crossed themselves whenever they heard the faint clinking of metal drifting through the night. And still, Josiah did not return. Yet every so often, when the wind turned just right, Ruth swore she could hear his voice in the distance, low, steady, humming the same sorrowful tune he used to hum beneath the tree. And beneath that song, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of chains dragging through the earth. 3 days passed after Silas's death, and the Warren plantation seemed frozen between dread and denial. The colonel drank himself into silence, keeping his pistol close, while the slaves worked under the watch of new men brought in from a neighboring estate. But even they felt it, the weight in the air, the way the shadows seemed to stretch too far at dusk. The oak tree stood like a sentinel at the edge of the fields, its leaves unmoving, its roots black with damp soil. And then, on the 4th morning, the ground gave up something that should have stayed buried. It was one of the dogs, or what was left of it. Brutus, the largest, was found at the base of the oak, his body half covered in dirt, his chain still attached, but twisted as if by immense force. His eyes were open, but there was no rot, no decay, no flies. His fur was stiff, coated in a dark, tar-like residue that smelled of iron and smoke. On his neck, burned into the flesh, was a mark. The same crude circle with 6 lines Ruth had seen, scratched inside the smokehouse. But now, one of the lines was gone. 5 remained. The discovery sent shock through the quarters. Some cried, some prayed. Ruth, trembling, gathered the courage to look closer. Beneath Brutus's body lay something glinting in the mud, a small piece of metal, old and warped. When she picked it up, her fingers stung with heat. It was the broken half of a shackle, the same kind Josiah had once worn. She dropped it and stumbled back. The others fled, leaving the corpse where it lay. Colonel Warren demanded the body be burned. "Whatever curse you people believe in," he said, voice shaking, "it ends tonight." He ordered a pit dug behind the kennels and stood there as they poured oil over the carcass. When the fire caught, the flames hissed blue instead of orange, and the air filled with a stench so foul it drove the men away. Warren stayed, jaw clenched, staring into the blaze as though daring it to challenge him. And then, as the smoke curled upward, he saw it. The faint outline of a man's face forming in the fire. The eyes, dark and knowing, the lips moving without sound. Warren stumbled backward, his skin drained of color. "No," he whispered. "No, it's not possible." That night, Ruth found him in his study, trembling beside an open bottle of brandy. His hands were stained with ash. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked quietly. Warren looked up, his eyes unfocused. "He's dead," he said. "I buried him myself." His voice cracked. "I buried him." Ruth stepped closer. "Then why's he still walking your land?" Hours later, as the house slept, another sound rose through the darkness, a slow, rhythmic clanging, metal striking against wood. The slaves woke in panic, clutching each other, eyes wide with terror. Ruth ran to the window and froze. Out by the oak, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, stood 6 shapes, 5 low and moving, 1 tall and still. The dogs, the missing ones. They circled something unseen, chains dragging through the grass, their eyes burning faintly red. And in the center of their ring, a shadow stood unmoving, head bowed. When lightning flashed across the sky, Ruth saw it clearly. Josiah, or what remained of him. His skin was ashen, his clothes torn, and around his wrists hung the remnants of broken iron. He was humming again, the same sorrowful tune. The dogs sat before him like soldiers awaiting orders, and then, in one swift motion, Josiah raised his head. His eyes were not human. They glowed with the same fire that had devoured the hound. Ruth gasped and fell back, but when she looked again, the yard was empty. No man, no dogs, only the oak swaying in the wind. Yet something had changed. The circle carved into the soil beneath the tree was no longer complete. Only 4 lines remained. By morning, Warren's servants found his study door open. His gun lay on the floor, still loaded. The windows were cracked from inside, as if something had pushed its way out. On his desk was a single word carved into the wood: reckoning. The following days brought an uneasy calm, but beneath it, the plantation pulsed with secrets too dark to surface. The slaves whispered in corners, sharing fragments of stories they had long buried, tales passed down from elders about the land itself being alive, remembering every lash, every scream. Some spoke of old spirits who had once walked these fields, guiding the oppressed to small victories hidden from the eyes of their masters. Josiah, they realized, had become more than a man. He was a living link to those memories, a vessel of vengeance and justice that transcended life itself. Ruth began piecing together what the elders had murmured for years. They spoke of hidden tunnels beneath the oak, dug long before Colonel Warren's family arrived. These tunnels were used by slaves as secret passageways, a means of escape, but also as spaces to hide objects of significance, charms, old chains, fragments of iron that carried ancestral power. The elders had warned that disturbing the oak or its roots risked awakening something ancient, something patient. And now, it seemed, the awakening had begun. Silas, still shaken by the events with the dogs and the fire, confided in Ruth late one night. He revealed that years ago, Warren had acquired certain disciplinary tools from another plantation. Iron shackles rumored to be cursed, objects soaked in pain meant to break even the strongest spirits. He had used them without thought, unaware that every act of cruelty imprinted itself into the land, twisting energy into a kind of memory that waited for a soul brave enough to challenge it. Josiah found it, Silas whispered, voice hoarse. He found the chains and the songs that go with them. He became part of it. Meanwhile, hidden letters surfaced among the belongings of Warren's ancestors, discovered accidentally by Ruth while cleaning the attic. They told of a secret network of overseers and slave owners who prided themselves on enforcing obedience through terror. In one letter, a man boasted about chaining a slave to dogs as a warning, the exact method used on Josiah. But there was a footnote. If the spirit survives, it will take vengeance on what it loves most. The implication was clear. Cruelty had consequences far beyond the imagination of men. The hidden connections didn't end there. Some of the hounds were not ordinary animals, but had been selectively bred for their violent tendencies. Each had a name and lineage that tied back to plantations across the South, trained not only to hunt, but to instill fear. Ruth realized that their disappearance, their strange behavior, and their apparent loyalty to Josiah were no coincidence. Something in the ground, in the iron, in Josiah himself, had shifted the balance. The dogs had become allies, not instruments of cruelty. Night after night, Ruth observed subtle signs of Josiah's lingering presence, small footprints that appeared and vanished near the oak, a faint humming that echoed through the quarters, objects moved from their places. She found broken shackles carefully arranged in patterns that mimicked the circle with lines, the same symbol that had appeared in the smokehouse. It was as if someone, or something, was communicating, leaving a message in plain sight. And then came the greatest revelation of all. One afternoon, Silas uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the old smokehouse. Inside lay a collection of objects, fragments of chains, old iron collars, and a journal written by a previous slave who had survived a similar punishment decades earlier. The final entry chilled Silas to the bone. One day the chains will find a man who refuses to break, and the dogs will remember his courage. The pieces began to form a terrifying puzzle. Josiah's endurance, the hound's behavior, the disturbances at the oak, and the echoes of ancestral warnings all pointed to something larger, a reckoning orchestrated across generations. It was not just revenge. It was a message encoded into the very land, a network of silent forces aligned against those who had built their power on cruelty. For Ruth, and those brave enough to witness, the plantation was no longer simply a place of labor and suffering. It was a living chronicle, a theater of unseen alliances and hidden truths. The past, the present, and the supernatural had converged. And in the center of it all stood Josiah, not just a man, but a symbol, a reminder that injustice leaves traces that time cannot erase. Every chain, every mark in the soil, every lingering shadow told a story. And the more Ruth uncovered, the clearer it became. Josiah's story was intertwined with every corner of the plantation, every whispered secret, and every soul who had dared to resist. The reckoning was not over. It had only begun. The night air was unusually still, as if the world itself held its breath. Shadows stretched long across the fields, the oak tree looming like a sentinel over the Warren plantation. The slaves had gathered quietly in their quarters, whispering prayers and clinging to each other, while Colonel Warren paced restlessly inside the house, his mind unraveling under the weight of dread. Something was coming, something he could not control, something that had begun with the defiance of a single man years earlier. As the moon rose high, a low rumble began, soft at first like distant thunder, then growing louder, rolling across the plantation like a living pulse. The dogs appeared at the edge of the field, moving as one, their eyes glowing faintly red in the moonlight. Brutus, Iron, Shade, Ghost, and Mercy all returned, their chains dragging but silent, and at the center of their formation stood Josiah, taller somehow than memory suggested, his presence commanding and terrifying all at once. His body was battered, his clothes tattered, but there was no fear in his eyes, only an unyielding fire that burned through the night. Colonel Warren stumbled to the veranda, pistol trembling in his hand. You cannot!" he shouted, but his voice lacked authority. The words fell flat, swallowed by the night. Josiah raised a hand and the dogs halted, forming a protective circle around him. Then he spoke, a voice low, steady, and filled with the weight of every soul who had suffered under cruelty. "All the pain you've caused, all the screams buried in the soil, all the chains and curses you thought would last forever, they end tonight." The wind shifted, carrying whispers from the past. Faces appeared in the moonlight, not human, but the impressions of those long gone, the spirits of the enslaved who had suffered before Josiah's time. They circled the plantation, their forms flickering, sometimes solid, sometimes fading like mist. The slaves watched from the quarters, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Ruth's hand shook as she clutched her rosary, but she knew they were witnessing justice, raw and unfiltered. Colonel Warren fired his pistol, the loud report tearing through the night. The bullet struck nothing. Josiah did not flinch. The dogs growled in unison, a sound that reverberated through the earth. Then the ground beneath Warren's feet shifted. Roots from the oak erupted violently, wrapping around his legs and throwing him to the ground. He screamed, trying to pull free, but the roots were unyielding, tight as iron, moving as though they possessed a will of their own. Josiah stepped closer, the fire in his eyes, reflecting in the colonel's terrified gaze. "The chains you forged to break others have returned to claim you," he said. The shadows around him coalesced, forming figures that mirrored the very punishments Warren had inflicted over the years. Whips snapping, shackles tightening, screams echoing. The master's hands clawed at the ground, at the roots, at the earth itself. But the plantation had remembered. Every act of cruelty was etched into the soil, woven into the trees, encoded in the bones and chains buried long ago. The slaves, watching from a distance, felt a mixture of fear and awe. This was not merely vengeance, it was reckoning. The land itself had risen, an ally to those who had once been powerless, and Josiah was its instrument. Ruth saw him raise a hand, and the roots receded slightly, releasing the colonel just enough to stumble backward. Warren's face was pale, lips quivering, eyes wide with disbelief. It cannot be, he whispered. A sudden howl tore through the night, not from the dogs, but from somewhere deep within the earth. Brutus and the others barked in response, circling Josiah protectively. Then a final revelation unfolded. From beneath the oak, a hidden cavity opened, long forgotten, sealed with dirt and roots, and inside lay hundreds of shackles, chains, and remnants of tormented lives, each one bearing a mark from the past masters of the land. But on top, unmistakably, rested Josiah's original shackle, broken in two, gleaming faintly as though reflecting the justice it had helped deliver. Josiah stepped into the cavity, his hands hovering over the chains. "For every life you crushed," he intoned, "for every scream you silenced, the earth remembers. The debt is paid." He touched the first shackle, and the others shifted, moving as if drawn to him. The chains wrapped themselves around the colonel, lifting him slightly from the ground. He screamed again, thrashing, but the strength of generations held him fast. The night seemed to stretch, every second laden with weight. The plantation, once a place of terror, now felt alive in a different way, alive with memory, with justice, with the presence of those who had been denied it for so long. Josiah's eyes met Ruth's for the briefest moment, conveying a sorrow that no words could capture, a sorrow born of witnessing centuries of pain. And then, as if the night itself had released its final breath, the shadows faded, the dogs settled, and the chains fell silent. Colonel Warren was never seen again. Some say he was taken by the roots, others claim the earth swallowed him whole. The slaves, now free from immediate fear, wept quietly, knowing that what they had witnessed was extraordinary. Josiah disappeared that night as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving only the broken shackle behind, a reminder that courage and endurance could outlast cruelty itself. And in the quiet that followed, Ruth understood the true revelation. The story was not merely about one man's defiance, but about the enduring power of memory, the justice of the earth, and the way darkness can be turned into light, if only one has the strength to survive it. Every root, every shadow, every echo carried the same truth. Injustice leaves marks that cannot be erased, and some souls, no matter how oppressed, will find a way to demand their reckoning. The morning after the events at the Oak, the plantation felt different, quieter, yet heavier, as if the land itself carried the weight of what had transpired. The enslaved men and women moved through their day with a new awareness, a mixture of fear, awe, and cautious hope. They had witnessed a justice that transcended human hands, a reckoning delivered by one who had endured years of torment and refused to be broken. The story of Josiah, his defiance, and the uprising of the dogs and the land itself became something more than legend. It became a symbol, a lesson written in scars and soil. Ruth walked through the fields, observing the subtle changes. The cotton seemed brighter in the morning light, the air cleaner, yet the shadows lingered longer than they should. She thought of the chains, of the hounds, of the roots that had taken Warren, and felt a mixture of sorrow and relief. The pain of centuries was not erased in a single night, but a balance had been struck, one that reminded everyone that cruelty could not remain unchecked forever. The plantation was a testament, both to the suffering endured and to the courage it inspired. Silas, who had survived his own encounter with the darkness, sat quietly by the oak, reflecting on his role in the past. He realized that his complicity, his blind obedience, had contributed to the horrors that unfolded over decades. Now, having witnessed the extraordinary power of endurance and memory, he carried a heavy burden of remorse. The revelation was clear. History was alive, and every act of injustice left marks that could fester or, when confronted, demand correction. The slaves, who had lived their lives under fear and oppression, began to speak of the night in hushed tones. They recounted the courage of Josiah, the loyalty of the dogs, and the way the land itself seemed to rise in judgment. Through these stories, passed quietly from one to another, they preserved a memory that could not be destroyed. Each retelling strengthened their understanding that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, resilience, intelligence, and quiet defiance could alter the course of suffering. For the masters who survived, the tale became a warning. They spoke little of it, avoiding the oak and the shadows that seemed to linger there. But in their private moments, many were haunted by fear. The knowledge that the power they wielded was neither absolute nor permanent. It was a realization that history, memory, and the will to resist could overturn the balance of control, and that injustice, no matter how deeply entrenched, carries consequences that cannot be ignored. The story of Josiah also raised questions that extended beyond the plantation. How many lives had been silenced and what had been left unavenged? How many injustices had passed unnoticed, waiting for someone brave enough to confront them? His courage became a symbol for those who would come after, a reminder that the oppressed could find ways to resist, that cruelty could never fully erase the human spirit, and that memory itself was a weapon more enduring than any whip or chain. Ruth understood that this was more than a tale of revenge or supernatural forces. It was a moral reflection on humanity itself, a record of what happens when injustice is left unchecked and the courage required to stand against it. Josiah's story was a warning, a lesson, and a memorial all at once. It reminded the living that every act of cruelty leaves an imprint, and that even when the oppressors believe they have silenced their victims, history has a way of speaking through the most unlikely of messengers. By the end of that day, the plantation had changed forever. The fields still bore the sweat of labor, and the night still carried shadows, but now hidden in the soil, in the roots, in whispered stories, was a truth that could not be erased. The courage of one man could awaken justice long denied, and memory, when preserved, could outlast even the darkest of cruelties. The impact of that night resonated beyond the plantation, beyond Alabama, beyond the boundaries of a single human life, leaving a lesson in its wake, that the past is never truly gone, and its echoes demand to be remembered. If you followed Josiah's story this far, you've witnessed more than just a man who struggled against cruelty. You've seen the power of resilience, courage, and the unyielding memory of those who suffered in silence. Now it's your turn to join the conversation. What do you think of Josiah's defiance? Could a single act of courage truly awaken forces beyond our understanding, or was it something else, something tied to the land, the spirits, or history itself? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective matters, and this is a place where curiosity and reflection are welcomed. Stories like this remind us that the past is never truly gone. Every chain, every scar, every act of injustice leaves a mark. And sometimes those marks demand recognition in ways we could never imagine. By discussing these events, you help keep the memory alive and honor those who endured the unimaginable. Write in the comments, what stood out to you the most? Was it Josiah's bravery, the supernatural elements, or the way justice found its own path? We want to hear your reflections, and your voice becomes part of this ongoing journey of discovery. If the story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we dive deep into hidden histories, mysteries buried by time, and tales that challenge what we think we know about the past. By subscribing and hitting the notification bell, you won't miss any of the dark historical stories we uncover. Each story is carefully researched and designed to take you inside moments of suspense, injustice, and revelation, just like Josiah's. Finally, if you feel compelled, invite others to witness these stories with you. Share this video with friends, family, or anyone fascinated by historical mysteries and the lessons they carry. Engage, discuss, and explore with us. The past is full of secrets, and together we can uncover them, reflect on them, and learn from them. Join our community, leave your mark in the comments, and become part of the conversation, because history is not only to be remembered, it's to be understood. As the sun set over the Warren plantation, the fields took on a golden glow, masking the darkness that had unfolded just nights before. The oak tree stood tall and silent, its roots deep in the soil, holding secrets that only a few had glimpsed. Josiah's story had reached its climax, but the echoes of his courage and the justice he had awakened lingered in every shadow, in every whisper of wind that rustled through the cotton. The plantation was forever changed, and so too were the hearts of those who had witnessed the events. Their lives now intertwined with a legacy of resistance, memory, and the unshakable truth that cruelty cannot endure unchallenged. Ruth walked slowly through the quarters, pausing to touch the walls, remembering the whispers of the past and the weight of what had occurred. She knew the story would live on, passed quietly from one generation to the next. The chains and the hounds, the oak and the hidden tunnels, all reminders that the past carries its own reckoning. Yet amidst the sorrow and the fear, there was a sense of awe, a recognition that courage, even in the smallest act, can ignite forces that reshape the world. For the slaves who remained, Josiah had become more than a man. He was a symbol, proof that endurance, intelligence, and defiance could survive even the harshest oppression. The land had spoken through him, and they had listened. And though Warren himself had vanished, the lesson he embodied lingered. Power built on cruelty is fragile, and justice, no matter how long delayed, has a way of finding its mark. Now, as the night deepened, Ruth could feel that this story, though concluded, was only one fragment of a far larger tapestry. She sensed that other secrets waited in the shadows of the plantation, in the attics, the basements, and the fields beyond. Forgotten voices murmured in the wind, carrying tales of injustice, vengeance, and courage, yet untold. The land was patient, and its memory was long. To those who stayed with the story until the end, take a moment to reflect. Josiah's struggle was not just a tale of the past. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, one act of bravery can awaken truths that echo across generations. His spirit, his defiance,